I offered a stranger everything I had to marry me by morning. I told myself it was survival. But the way he looked at me, like he already knew how this would end, I should have understood. Some bargains aren't made with men. If you've ever made a choice you knew was reckless, because the alternative was unbearable, stay. This story knows that feeling. Subscribe and let it find you again. The decision had not been born of courage. It had been born of watching my father die slowly, and realizing that when he was gone, I would have nothing left to call my own. I stood at the window of his chambers, watching the last of the suitors' carriages disappear down the long drive. Lord Beaumont. The fourth this month. He had spoken to my father for 2 hours about land yields and trade routes. He had spoken to me for perhaps 6 minutes, and in those 6 minutes, his eyes had wandered 3 times to the family crest above the fireplace, twice to the silver candlesticks, and never once to my face. Vivian. My father's voice came from behind me, weaker than it had been even yesterday. He was acceptable, wealthy, connected. He was a ledger with legs, Papa. I turned from the window. He didn't see me. He saw acreage. My father sat in the chair by the fire, wrapped in blankets though the summer heat pressed against the windows. The Count du Martel, once the strongest man I had ever known, looked like paper now, like something the wind might carry away. They all see acreage, he said quietly. That is what we are to them, what you will be when I'm gone. The words landed like stones in my chest. I crossed to him, kneeling beside his chair, taking his thin hand in mine. His skin was cold. It was always cold now. You're not going anywhere. But we both knew I was lying. The physician had been clear. His heart was failing, had been failing for months, though he'd hidden it from me with the same stubborn pride that had built this estate from nothing. Weeks, the physician had said. Perhaps days, if he continued to strain himself with these audiences, these endless parades of suitors he summoned for my benefit. I need to know you're protected, he whispered. When I married your mother, I had nothing. She chose me anyway. She saw something in me that no one else did. His eyes glistened. I wanted that for you. A man who would see you. Not the gold. Not the name. You. My throat tightened. I remembered my mother only in fragments, a laugh, a scent, the warmth of arms that held me before the fever took her. I was 3 years old when she died, giving birth to a brother who never drew breath. My father had raised me alone, pouring into me everything he had once given her. And now he was leaving too. I'll find someone, I heard myself say. I promise. He shook his head slowly. The inheritance laws, you know what happens if you're unmarried when I pass. Everything goes to your cousin, Gabrielle. He spoke the name like a curse. He'll sell it all. The land, the house, everything your mother and I built. He'll erase us, Vivian. As if we never existed. I knew. God, I knew. Gabriel du Martel, my father's nephew, a man who had visited exactly twice in my lifetime and both times had looked at me the way the suitors did. Like I was an obstacle between him and what he wanted. Then I won't let you die, I said, my voice cracking. Not until I'm ready. My father smiled, that sad, knowing smile that broke my heart every time I saw it. My darling girl. So fierce. So stubborn. He lifted his hand to my cheek. So alone. The word cut deeper than he knew. Because he was right. I had spent 28 years building walls. Refusing suitors who saw only gold. Telling myself that I was strong, independent, that I didn't need anyone. But the truth I had buried so deep I barely recognized it anymore, was simpler and more devastating. I was terrified that no one would ever want me for myself. That beneath the gold and the name and the estate, there was nothing worth choosing. That night, after my father had fallen into a fitful sleep and the house had grown quiet, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not wait for another Lord Beaumont. I would not parade before another man who saw only acreage. I would go into the city, into the places where no one knew the du Martel name. And I would find anyone who might look at me and see something other than inheritance. It was desperate. It was reckless. It was the act of a woman who had run out of options.
and it would lead me to him.
To the stranger with ancient eyes who sat alone in a dim tavern, watching the world as if he had already seen everything it had to offer. To the man who would agree to marry me without asking what I was worth. To Tristan Marcellus, the vampire king. 3 days later, my father collapsed at dinner. One moment he was lifting his wine glass, telling me about the autumn my mother had insisted on planting roses in soil that everyone said wouldn't hold them. She was stubborn, he said, and his eyes were soft with a love that had never dimmed, not in 25 years of absence. Like you. She said the roses didn't know they weren't supposed to grow there, so why should she tell them? The next moment, the glass slipped from his fingers. His face went gray. And then he was falling, and I was screaming his name, and the servants were rushing in, and the world I had built my entire life around was crumbling like ash in my hands. The physician came within the hour. I sat outside my father's chambers, my hands still stained with the wine that had spilled across the white tablecloth like blood, and I listened to the murmur of voices through the door. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't need to. The physician's face when he finally emerged told me everything. His heart, he said, and I watched his mouth move, but the words seemed to come from very far away. It's been failing for some time. He hid it well, but the strain of these past weeks. He trailed off. We both knew what he meant. The suitors. The audiences. The desperate attempt to see me settled before. How long? The physician hesitated.
Days.
Perhaps a week if he rests. If there's no more excitement.
Days. A week.
I had measured my father's life in years, in decades. In the endless stretch of time that exists when you're young and foolish enough to believe the people you love will always be there. Now I was measuring it in days. I went into his chamber after the physician left. My father lay propped against pillows, his breathing shallow, his skin the color of old parchment. But his eyes were still sharp. Still him. Don't look at me like that, he said weakly. I'm not dead yet, Papa. Sit down, Vivian. He patted the bed beside him. There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you months ago. I sat. I took his hand. I held on like I could anchor him to this world through sheer force of will. The inheritance laws, he began, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. When I die, if you're unmarried, the estate doesn't pass to you. It passes to the nearest male heir. Gabrielle. Yes. The word was heavy with exhaustion and regret. I tried to change it. I petitioned the courts, hired advocates, spent a fortune trying to find a way around it. But the law is clear. A woman cannot inherit without a husband to manage the property on her behalf. The injustice of it burned in my throat. I had run this estate for the past 3 years, ever since my father's health began to fail. I had negotiated with merchants, settled disputes with tenants, managed ledgers and harvests, and 100 daily crises. And none of it mattered, because I had been born without the right name between my legs. There's still time, my father said, his grip tightening on my hand. If you marry before. He couldn't finish. The suitors.
No.
His voice was surprisingly firm.
Not them.
I won't have you chained to a man who sees you as a business transaction. Not for my sake. Not for the estate. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were wet. I've made so many mistakes, Vivian. But I won't make that one. I won't sell you to save a pile of stones. I should have been touched. I was touched. But beneath the love, beneath the grief that was already carving a hollow in my chest, something else was taking root. An idea. Desperate. Reckless. Possibly mad. If the suitors saw only gold, then I would go where there was no gold to see. If the noble circles offered only fortune hunters, then I would step outside those circles entirely. I would go into the city, not as Lady Vivian du Martel, but as no one. A woman in common clothes with nothing to offer but herself. And I would find someone, anyone, a man who would agree to a marriage of convenience. A contract. Names on paper. Nothing more. He wouldn't need to love me.
He wouldn't even need to stay.
He just needed to exist long enough to sign the documents, to satisfy the law, to let me keep the only thing I had left of my mother, my father, my entire history. It was desperate. It was beneath me. It was exactly the kind of reckless choice I had spent my whole life avoiding. But as I sat there holding my father's hand, feeling his pulse flutter weak and uneven beneath my fingers, I understood something I had been hiding from myself for years. I was already alone. I had been alone since I was 3 years old, and my mother's arms went cold around me. I might as well be alone on my own terms. Tomorrow. I would go tomorrow, before my father weakened further, before my courage failed, before the walls I had built around my heart convinced me to settle for a Lord Beaumont after all. Tomorrow, I would find a stranger, and I would offer him everything I had. I left before dawn, while the house still slept and my father's breathing remained steady behind his chamber door. I had kissed his forehead in the darkness, whispered a promise I wasn't sure I could keep, and slipped out through the servants' entrance like a thief in my own home. The dress I wore had belonged to one of the kitchen maids, simple gray wool, patched at the elbows, smelling faintly of wood smoke and honest labor. I had traded her 3 silver coins for it, and she had looked at me like I had lost my mind. Perhaps I had. Perhaps losing your mind was the only sane response to watching your world collapse around you. Lyon in the early morning was a different city than the one I knew from carriage windows and formal visits. The old quarter sprawled beneath a gray sky, its narrow streets still damp from the night's rain, its buildings leaning into each other like old friends sharing secrets. I moved through it like a ghost, invisible in my borrowed clothes, and for the first time in my life, no one looked at me twice. It should have been liberating. Instead, it felt like confirmation of everything I had always feared. Without the gold, without the name, I was no one. I searched for hours. I passed through market squares where vendors shouted prices and housewives haggled over bread. I lingered in taverns where men drank away their mornings, studying their faces, looking for something, anything, that might tell me this one could be trusted. But everywhere I looked, I saw the same thing I had seen in the suitors who paraded through my father's hall. Hunger, calculation, the endless arithmetic of what they could take. By midday, my feet ached, and my hope had begun to curdle into something darker. This had been foolish, desperate. The fantasy of a woman who had run out of options and convinced herself that somewhere, in the vast anonymous sprawl of the city, she might find what she had failed to find in her own world. A man who would see her. I was about to turn back when I found the tavern. It sat at the edge of the old quarter, tucked into a corner where 2 crooked streets met. No sign marked its door, just a weathered wooden entrance that might have been 100 years old or 1,000. Something about it made me stop, made me push open the door and step inside. The interior was dim, lit only by candles that had burned down to stubs and a fire that smoldered more than it burned. A handful of patrons sat scattered at tables, their conversations low and private. The air smelled of old wine and wood smoke and something else, something I couldn't name, but that made the hair on my arm stand up. And then I saw him. He sat alone in the far corner, his back to the wall, a glass of wine before him that he hadn't touched. He wasn't old, but he wasn't young either, somewhere in between, in that timeless space where age becomes irrelevant. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his clothes, though simple, fit him like they had been made by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. But it was his eyes that stopped me. They were watching the room with the stillness of someone who had stopped expecting anything from it. Not bored, not tired, just finished. Like a man who had already seen everything the world had to offer and found it wanting. I knew that look. I had seen it in my own mirror in the moments between the masks I wore for everyone else. Before I could talk myself out of it, I crossed the room. He looked up as I approached, and something flickered in those dark eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition, though I was certain we had never met. I need a husband by tomorrow. The words came out steadier than I felt. I can pay you. He didn't laugh. He didn't look offended or confused or any of the things I had expected. He simply studied me, and I had the strangest feeling that he was seeing not just my face, but everything beneath it. Every fear, every wound, every desperate hope I had carried into this dim tavern at the edge of the world. The silence stretched between us, and I forced myself not to look away, not to apologize, not to explain. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, quiet, carrying an accent I couldn't place. "Keep your money." My heart sank. Of course. Of course this had been foolish. I started to turn away, already composing the apology, the retreat, the long walk back to a future I couldn't escape. "I'll marry you." I froze. Turned back. He was still watching me with those impossible eyes, and there was something in his expression now that I couldn't read. Something almost like wonder.
Why?
The word escaped before I could stop it. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rose from his chair, and I realized he was taller than I had thought, his presence somehow larger than the space he occupied. He moved toward me, and I should have stepped back, should have been afraid, but I wasn't. I wasn't afraid at all. "Because you didn't tell me what you were worth," he said quietly. "You just told me what you needed."
I didn't understand.
I couldn't understand. But standing there in that dim tavern, looking up into the face of a stranger who had just agreed to bind his life to mine, I felt something shift in my chest. Something that might have been hope, or might have been the beginning of something far more dangerous. "My name is Vivian," I said. He smiled, and the expression transformed his face in ways I wasn't prepared for. "Tristan. Tristan Marcellus." He offered his hand, and I took it. His skin was cold. We married before dawn in a chapel so small it had no name. The priest was old, half-blind, and asked no questions when I pressed coins into his palm. He read the vows by candlelight, his voice trembling with age, and I repeated words I had heard 100 times at other women's weddings, words I had always imagined speaking to someone I loved. Instead, I spoke them to a stranger whose last name I had learned only hours before. Tristan's voice was steady when he made his vows. No hesitation. No wavering. As if promising his life to a woman he had just met was the most natural thing in the world. When the priest asked for rings, Tristan produced one from his pocket, a simple silver band, worn smooth with age, and slipped it onto my finger before I could ask where it had come from. "It was my mother's," he said quietly, answering the question I hadn't spoken. I looked at the ring, then at him. "You carry your mother's wedding ring with you?" Something passed through his eyes. Something old and heavy and full of shadows. "I carry everything I have left of her with me." The priest pronounced us married as the first gray light began to seep through the chapel windows. No bells rang. No guests cheered. There was only the guttering of candles and the distant sound of the city waking beyond the walls. I had a husband. I had saved my father's legacy. And I had no idea what I had done. The carriage ride back to the estate was silent. Tristan sat across from me, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside, and I found myself studying him in the growing light. He was handsome. I had noticed that in the tavern, but here, with dawn illuminating his features, it struck me differently. There was something ageless about his face. Something that didn't quite fit the rough clothes he wore or the quiet humility of his manner. "You're staring," he said without turning from the window. Heat flooded my cheeks.
I'm sorry.
You're wondering what kind of man agrees to marry a stranger for nothing." Now he did look at me, and the intensity of his gaze made my breath catch. "You're wondering what I want?" "Yes." "I told you. You didn't tell me what you were worth." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He turned back to the window, and I understood that he would tell me nothing more. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. I should have been afraid. A wiser woman would have been terrified. But wisdom had never been my strength. My father was awake when we arrived, propped up in bed with the physician hovering nearby. His face lit up when I entered, and then he saw Tristan behind me, and something shifted in his expression. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. "Papa," I began, "this is Tristan Marcellus." My father's voice was barely a whisper. "You found him." I froze. Found him? But I had never mentioned Tristan. Had never described him, had never even spoken his name in this house. Tristan stepped forward, and I watched my father's face as the two men looked at each other. There was something passing between them that I couldn't read, a conversation happening in a language I didn't speak. Then my father began to cry. Not with grief. Not with fear. With relief so profound it seemed to pour out of him, like something that had been dammed up for years. "Thank you," he whispered, reaching for Tristan's hand. "Thank you." Tristan took his hand gently, carefully, as if my father were made of glass. "Rest now," Tristan said, and his voice was different, softer, older, carrying an authority that didn't match his appearance. "Your daughter is safe. Everything you built will endure." My father's eyes fluttered closed, his breathing evening out into the first peaceful sleep I had seen him take in months. And I stood there, frozen, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. "How does he know you?" I demanded once we were in the hallway. "How does he know your name?" Tristan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Some questions have answers that will only frighten you." "I'm not afraid." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something in his gaze made my heart stutter. "You should be." The first nights, we kept our distance. Separate rooms on opposite ends of the corridor, careful formality whenever we passed. A marriage in name only, exactly as I had proposed. But I couldn't stop noticing him. He moved without sound. I would turn and find him there, in doorways, in corners, watching me with those dark eyes. He knew the layout of the house before I showed him, knew which doors creaked, which stairs groaned, which passages led where. As if he had walked these halls 1,000 times before. And his skin. Every accidental touch, a brush of fingers passing a cup, a steadying hand when I stumbled. His skin was cold. Not cool. Cold. Like marble left too long in winter shade. But his gaze burned. He looked at me like he was starving, and I was something he couldn't allow himself to taste. On the fourth night, I lay awake listening to the silence of the house and asked myself the question I had been avoiding since the moment he took my hand in that dim tavern. What have I invited into my home?
What have I bound myself to?
And why, despite everything, did some part of me hope I would never have to let him go? On the seventh night, I followed him. I had been lying awake again, staring at the canopy above my bed, when I heard it, the soft click of a door closing somewhere in the house. Footsteps that made no sound, but somehow I felt them anyway, like a disturbance in the air itself. I rose before I could talk myself out of it, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, stepped into the corridor. The house was dark, but moonlight poured through the tall windows, painting silver paths along the floors. I followed them like breadcrumbs, moving through rooms I had known my entire life that suddenly felt foreign. Haunted. The garden door stood open. I stepped through it and into the night. He was standing in the center of the rose garden, my mother's roses, the ones she had planted in soil that wasn't supposed to hold them. The moon hung full and heavy above the estate, and its light fell on Tristan like a spotlight, illuminating every detail. He wasn't moving, not breathing, not blinking. He stood utterly, impossibly still, his face turned up toward the sky, and in that moment I understood something I had been refusing to see since the first time he touched me with those cold, cold hands. He wasn't a man. He was something else. Something older. Something that wore humanity the way I had worn that kitchen maid's dress, a borrowed coat, a disguise, a thing to be shed when no longer needed. "I know you're there." His voice carried across the garden, soft as a whisper, but clear as a bell. "You've known for days, Vivian. You just didn't want to believe it." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee, to barricade myself in my chambers and pray that whatever stood in my mother's garden would leave before dawn. Instead, I stepped forward. "What are you?" He turned then, and the moonlight caught his eyes. They gleamed, not reflected light, but something deeper, something that came from within. Ancient, endless, full of centuries I couldn't fathom. "You already know." His voice was gentle.
Sad.
"You've known since the tavern. Since I took your hand, and you felt how cold I was." "Say it." He was silent for a long moment. Then, "I am what your fairy tales warned you about." What your priests used to frighten children into prayer. He took a step toward me, and I held my ground, though every nerve in my body screamed. I am Tristan Marcellus. I've been called many things over the centuries: demon, monster, god. But the word your kind settled on was vampire. Vampire. The word hung in the air between us, and I waited for the terror to overwhelm me. Waited to scream, to faint, to do any of the things a sensible woman would do when confronted with a creature of darkness in her own garden. But the terror didn't come. Or rather, it did, but beneath it stirred something else. Something that felt dangerously like understanding. The Vampire King, I heard myself say. My father knew your name. He recognized you. Your father is older than he appears. Tristan's smile was faint, bitter. His family has known of my kind for generations. He knew what you were bringing home. He wept with relief because he knew I would protect you in ways no mortal husband ever could. Protect me from what? From everything. From fortune hunters. From your cousin. From the loneliness that was eating you alive. The accuracy of those words stole my breath. Why? My voice cracked. Why would you? You're a king. You said so yourself. Why would you agree to marry a stranger in a tavern? Why would you care about my loneliness? Tristan moved closer, and this time I did step back, not from fear but from the intensity of what I saw in his face. Raw. Unguarded. More human than anything I had seen in the men who had paraded through my father's hall. Because I recognized it. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that I could see the faint lines around his eyes, lines that hadn't been there in the tavern, lines that appeared and disappeared like memories. I abandoned my throne 300 years ago, he said quietly. I walked away from an empire because I couldn't bear it anymore. The worship, the fear, the endless subjects who looked at me and saw only power. I have spent centuries wandering, searching for something I thought no longer existed. What? Someone who would look at me and see what you saw in that tavern. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Loneliness. Just loneliness. Not a monster. Not a king. Just a man sitting alone with wine he couldn't drink, waiting for something he had stopped believing would come. Tears burned in my eyes. I didn't understand why. This creature had deceived me, had bound himself to me under false pretenses, had brought something ancient and dangerous into my home. But I understood loneliness. God, I understood it. You should run, Tristan said, and there was no threat in his voice, only exhaustion. You should go back inside and bar your door, and in the morning, tell your father what I am. I will leave. I will dissolve the marriage. You will be safe. Safe. The word tasted like ash. I have been safe my entire life. I have been so safe that I have never let anyone close enough to hurt me. And I could hurt you. His eyes blazed with something that might have been hunger or might have been despair. I could destroy you without meaning to. You don't understand what I am. No, I agreed. I don't. I stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the cold radiating from his skin, close enough to see the struggle in his ancient eyes. But I'm starting to. They came 3 nights later. I was in my father's chambers, reading to him by candlelight, when the air in the house changed. I felt it before I heard anything, a pressure, a wrongness, like the moment before a storm breaks. My father's eyes flew open, and for the first time in weeks, I saw fear in them. Vivian, get Tristan. Now. I didn't ask questions. I ran. I found him in the corridor, already moving toward me, and the expression on his face stopped me cold. Gone was the quiet man who had sat across from me at dinner, who had listened to my stories about my mother, who had looked at me like I was something precious. In his place stood something else entirely. Something ancient. Something terrifying. Stay behind me, he said, and his voice was different. Layered, resonant, carrying the weight of centuries. Whatever happens, stay behind me. The front doors exploded inward. 3 figures entered through the splintered wood, moving with that same unnatural stillness I had seen in Tristan. But where his stillness had felt like patience, theirs felt like predation. They were beautiful, All of them, in the way that poisonous things are beautiful. Sharp and gleaming and wrong. Tristan Marcellus. The one in front spoke, his voice dripping with false courtesy. 300 years, and you've been hiding in a French farmhouse. Playing husband to a mortal. He looked at me, and I felt his gaze like ice water down my spine. She's pretty, I'll give you that. Is she why you abandoned us? Leave, Aldrich. Tristan's voice was steady.
Deadly.
This is not your territory. All territory is ours. You made it so once. Aldrich stepped closer, and the other two fanned out around him. The old bloodlines are waking. They want their king back. Come home, Tristan. Or we'll burn everything you've built here and drag you home through the ashes. No. Then we'll start with her. They moved faster than my eyes could follow. One moment Aldrich was across the room, the next his hand was around my throat, lifting me off my feet, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but claw uselessly at fingers that felt like iron. And then Tristan moved. I had thought I understood what he was. I had seen him stand still as death in the moonlight, had felt the cold of his skin, had looked into eyes that held centuries. But I had not understood. What Tristan became in that moment was beyond anything I could have imagined. He was darkness and fury, and something so ancient it predated language. He moved through the three vampires like wind through wheat, and I heard sounds, terrible sounds, sounds I would hear in nightmares for years to come. And then Aldrich's hand was gone from my throat, and I was falling.
Tristan caught me.
He was covered in blood. Their blood, I realized dimly, and his eyes were blazing with that inner light, and he was shaking. Not from exertion. From something else. Are you hurt? His voice was ragged.
Vivian.
Are you hurt? I shook my head. I couldn't speak. He set me down gently, carefully, as if I might break. Then he stepped back, and I watched the monster recede, watched the man return, and both of them looked at me with the same expression.
Terror.
Not of what he had done. Of what I might do now that I had seen it. I'm going to dissolve the marriage, he said, his voice hollow.
Tonight.
I'll speak to your father, explain that I'm leaving. You can return to your world. Find a proper husband. Forget what I am, what you saw, what.
No.
The word came out stronger than I expected. Tristan froze. Vivian. I said no. I stepped toward him, and he flinched. This creature, who had just destroyed 3 of his own kind without breaking a sweat, flinched from me. I'm not going back to my world. I'm not finding a proper husband. And I am not going to forget. You don't understand what you're choosing. I understand exactly what I'm choosing. I stopped in front of him, close enough to touch, close enough to see the blood on his face, the anguish in his ancient eyes. I'm choosing you, not because you saved me, not because of what you are or what you can do, but because you were the first person in my entire life who looked at me and saw me. Not the gold, not the name, not the estate, just me. I'm a monster. You're lonely. I reached up and touched his face, cold, so cold, but somehow still the most real thing I had ever felt.
So am I.
I have been lonely my whole life, and I have been so afraid of it that I never let anyone close enough to matter. But you, my voice broke. You matter, and I would rather face whatever comes with you than go back to being safe and alone. His eyes searched mine, looking for the lie, the doubt, the inevitable retreat. He didn't find it. I chose you knowing you were dangerous, I whispered. I choose you still. My father died at dawn. I was holding his hand when it happened, sitting in the chair I had barely left for days. Tristan stood in the doorway, close enough to be present, far enough to give us privacy. My father's eyes were open, clear for the first time in weeks, and when he looked at me, he smiled. You found him, he whispered. Someone who sees you. His gaze moved to Tristan, and something passed between them again. That language I still didn't speak but was beginning to understand. Take care of her, my father said. Always, Tristan answered. For as long as she'll have me. My father's hand tightened on mine. Then, slowly it relaxed. And he was gone. I wept. I wept like I hadn't wept since I was a child too young to understand why my mother's arms had gone cold. I wept for the father who had raised me alone, who had loved me enough to let me choose my own path, who had known what Tristan was and trusted him anyway. But this time, when the grief threatened to swallow me whole, I wasn't alone. Tristan's arms wrapped around me from behind, cold, yes, but solid. Present.
Real.
There are other women like me. Women who walked into the dark because the light had stopped feeling safe. Their stories wait here, quiet, patient. If you don't want to lose them, subscribe. Stay close. Let the next one find you when you're ready. The estate is mine now. The Du Martel legacy continues. And beside me, through every night and every dawn, stands the stranger I found in a dim tavern at the edge of Lyon. The man who agreed to marry me without asking what I was worth. The vampire king who had abandoned his throne because he couldn't bear to be worshipped by those who feared him. I had offered a stranger everything I owned to marry me. I never imagined he would give me something I didn't know I was missing. Permission to stop protecting myself from love.